Blumenfeld Gambit, a modern repertoire, Part 6. Blumenfeld accepted traditional mainline and side variations. We're going to open with the traditional moves d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, c5, d5, and now b5, d takes e6, f takes e6, c takes b5, going into the accepted variation, and now the move d5. This is the traditional main line. Later in the series, in the next part, I'm going to present you with alternatives to d5, including the moves bishop b7, as well as a6, and even the possibility of bishop to e7. These are all kind of modern alternatives to the traditional move d5. The idea being with bishop e7, for example, if we're not going to play d5, the bishop obviously must go to e7. But the primary alternatives are a6 and bishop to b7. Here in this part, we're going to take a look at our first option, which is the traditional treatment with d5. The most traditional treatment here for white is to play the classical move e3. This variation with e3, or possibly g3, or finally the most aggressive option, which is to play the move knight to c3. We'll take a look at all these possibilities. First with the e3. This goes back to our oldest games in the historical part of the video, where traditionally black gets a very strong kingside attack because his pieces are more active, bishop coming to d6 very aggressively. In the first games, white played kind of passively with this e3, b3 type of setup. But I think that objectively white's best is to play for the move e4. And a modern treatment for e3 is even possible. I found what I think to be the best play for both sides would follow here bishop d6. And now not this old-fashioned, slow, passive bishop e2. I think even Karpov has played like that, but this is not active enough for white. White really must strive to play e4 against this oncoming pawn center that black is going to amass with eventually e5, d5, and c5. White has to be ready to meet that with the move e4, or even preemptively strike with e4, as is the case here. So I think if you're going to play this setup for white, probably the most aggressive is to play knight c3 first of all, without even playing the move e3. But just to show the possibilities here for white, I think the best now is probably knight to c3. And when black castles, white plays e4. He needs to have a knight on c3 or some sort of piece supporting the move e4. And the idea for white is to more or less force black's pawns to become fractured or broken or segmented or broken. And this will allow black to slowly have weaknesses and give white some outposts for his pieces and so forth. So the general idea for black, looking at all the possible lines here, is that it's best to keep the tension. This is normal in all chess openings, in the opening stages, but here there's no exceptions. It's possible to play d4, and it's not really good. So the best seems to follow this game that I found from 2007, bishop c7 for black, avoiding the pawn fork on e5, bishop c7, bishop d3, and now knight on b to d7, striving for control of the e5 square. It's a little like a semi-Slav or some kind of semi-Tarash, where black is really focused on that e5 square, Rubinstein style. Here is a game that I found from 2007, Schwartz versus Banawa, white castles. And now that's where the game, I think, like finished being perfectly played. My analysis here would continue with a different move from the actual game, where the tension was broken. I think that black could play one of two moves in this position. First of all, we can go for the classic knight to e5. And the second possibility for black would be just continuing development with bishop to b7. Bishop b7, queen e2, maintaining this so-called strong point here on e4. Everything focusing on e4. It's really Other than the fact that white is up a pawn, all he has is this strong point on e4. His whole position is based around it. So naturally, queen e2. And black's set up again like a semi-Tarrasch or some sort of queen's gambit accepted as far as the piece configuration goes. Black needs to find some sort of fluid move here to continue the development. And I think it must be a queen move. And there are two possibilities I would offer here for black to enhance the setup. One is a rather traditional move, queen e8. Maneuvering over here to the king's side with queen e8 and eventually queen h5. By the way, this is a very typical Blumenfeld maneuver in the accepted variation. And secondly, an interesting possibility after queen e2, queen b8. This is definitely more of the semi-Tarrasch, queen's gambit accepted style of pressure with the pieces on the dark diagonal, enhanced by the diagonal of the bishop on b7. Black has compensation for the sacrificed pawns because of the pawn duo at d5 and c5. So I think this variation is fully playable for black. Now again, going back to the starting position for the traditional main line, after both pawns have been captured at e6 and b5, black plays d5. Now the most solid option for white is the move g3. And after g3, I think that black must play to eliminate the pawn on b5. The white pawn structure on the king's side, it's not a traditional one with e3. It's actually quite solid, this kingside fianchetto structure. So it's not going to be easy for black to attack the white king, like in a game from 1920. The white kingside is very solid. Attempts to attack directly are not necessarily viable. So the best is a kind of all across the board strategy. We're playing in the center with our pawn mass. We're trying to eliminate the pawn on b5, play a little bit of Benko Gambit style play on the queen side, and we'll keep in mind to play the whole board. The best variation I've found is a6 for black here. There really is no reason black has to rush to develop the king's side. First a6, destroying the strong pawn on b5, but the follow-up one must be very accurate. After b takes a6, we're not simply making the move a6 to get Benko style play on the queen side. That is a component of it, but it looks like best was played in a Todorovic-Djokic game from 2012. We eliminate the pawn on b5 and then are able to develop our knight actively on c6. So knight to c6 here, getting the knight to a square where it controls the center very powerfully. Knight c6 controlling d4, controlling e5. That's the value in eliminating that pawn on b5. And now white can play bishop g2, but it doesn't put very much pressure on the position. I think black gets a perfectly good game there. So the best is bishop h3 for white, putting pressure on the base of our pawn chain, if you will, on e6. I've played a few blitz games with the white pieces in this type of position, however, and I can tell you that there are some risks involved in playing bishop h3. The underlying risk is that eventually e5 will happen, the white square bishop will get exchanged. That could weaken the white king side. So this is quite an aggressive plan, though statistically it's been best for white. Bishop h3, rook takes a6, which is a good move on several levels. We could later perhaps set up something like queen e8 with pressure down the a file, but we're also laterally defending with rook on a6. The e6 point is our really only tangible weakness, and I think that rook a6 guards everything, and this river guarding rook will guard our weak point at e6. Castles by white, and now again it feels aggressive to put the bishop on d6, but with the pawn on g3 and that type of kingside formation, it doesn't necessarily pay dividends to play with the bishop on d6 here. It's better to play bishop e7 in this setup, also allowing for that rook on a6 to potentially have lateral movement or lateral defensive capability. Now knight to c3, castles, completing kingside development. By the way, bishop e7 also defends in the case of any kind of bishop g5 ideas. Now white played knight g5 in the game Todorovic versus Djokic, and I think that white's intention is to try to play something like e4 in one moment. Black here played knight e5. And although in this particular game, Todorovic versus Djokic 2012, although white went on to win the game, I don't think that white necessarily has any advantage here. Knight e5, although it's undefended, it's simply a useful move defending the e6 weakness. And we can challenge the knight on g5 with knight f7 if necessary, but I think we can just simply kick that guy away with h6. And black will have plans like c4 in the future. So, according to my evaluation of this position, I really don't think that despite being down a pawn, black is worse here. He has too much good control of the center. All the black pieces are basically developed. Even the bishop on c8 is effectively useful, not interfering with any of the pieces, giving us good defense of e6. Black has lots of active pieces, lots of active lines here, and I think he should have equal dynamic chances in the future. Next, in the traditional main line, we come to the most interesting and combative move for white, knight to c3. This move, knight to c3, it may seem strange to a beginner because you see the oncoming black pawn center, and you say, well, that's crazy. Why would you put your knight on a square where black can just advance here with d4 and drive it away? But truthfully, black has to take care in the Blumenfeld, because every time you move these pawns forward, there become possibilities for them to become weak, to be exchanged off, to be chipped away at by the enemy pawns. There become outposts on the board, the squares that you leave unprotected. So d4 is not really a good move for black. There are several possibilities for black here, keeping the tension, so to speak. Probably many possible moves. a6, bishop b7, bishop e7, all these moves make sense. But again, I would never put my bishop on d6, for example, which would be a configuration that would allow like a pawn fork to happen with e4, e5. You've got to be wary of that kind of thing. But first of all, I think that the best move for black here is knight on bd7. This is a useful move, and we're going to develop smoothly. But we've got to be prepared for white to play e4. That is what's going to happen. And I don't think that in this variation, black can afford to just maintain the tension. It looks like after knight on bd7, e4, it's not enough to maintain the tension. We can't keep e6 protected if we allow an exchange on d5. It's just opening up too fast. So apparently we have to play d4 here. And this is a concession. This is what we really wanted to avoid in this opening, not allowing our pawns to be drawn forward and the outpost squares to appear on c4 and e4. And the play becomes very tactical. The main line is e5. This is one of white's most promising variations, no doubt, but I think that black can hold the line. After e5, knight to g4. There are other moves that have been played by black other than knight on bd7, but after researching this, I have found this definitely seems to be the best, and the only line that really hopes for black to achieve equality. Knight to g4. Now, knight to e4 is an interesting move, but the main line is knight to g5, attacking e6 and attacking the knight on g4. We take on e5 with a d knight. Now white has a knight hanging, but white has counter threats. And I found a very, very interesting game here, played in 2014. So this is relatively recent. Not an overly trendy opening, not an overly trendy variation. This is a sideline within an opening that's not that popular. Only maybe 1 in 10 games can you actually get the Blumenfeld Gambit on the board in a typical tournament repertoire. f4, bishop e7, counterattacking. This is a fantastic game, I think perfectly played by both sides. Knight on c to e4. And in the game, Sipke Ernst, the Dutch grandmaster playing white against Snuverink, a master rated around 2350, I believe. Knight on c to e4, castles. White played h3, and here Snuverink played knight to f6. This is is okay for black, but I think that white retains like a very small advantage after the move knight f6. So Sipke Ernst versus Nuverik went knight f6. But here black has an amazing position, and he missed a move that could be played in the future in a tournament game. This position is absolutely critical for both sides, and black here missed the move knight f2, which I think is just spectacular. This is a computer-generated idea, and it's a long-term piece sacrifice. But all of black's pieces are basically developed. If you imagine that bishop b7 is coming in very quickly, all the black pieces will be developed, and the white pieces are basically still on the first rank. There are two possible variations. I'll show you quickly. If knight takes f2, black plays bishop takes g5, and then f takes g5, and now bishop b7, with massive compensation for material. Just absolutely massive compensation for the material. So the queen will be coming to d5. There are threats along the long diagonal, positional piece sacrifices like knight to f3 check, and the pawns are advancing to c4 and choking the white position with c4 and d3. This is just a sacrificial master's dream position, really. It's very, very hard for white to use his extra piece. I think that black is probably better, but we'll just say compensation for material. And the other possibility is for white to take with the king. King takes f2, bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, and queen takes g5. And now the white king will try to hide. This is just an analysis variation. It's never been played before. King g1, and then a very nice forced sacrifice. Rook takes f4, bishop takes f4, queen takes f4, and black has a fantastic initiative for the sacrificed exchange. Sacrificed a knight, a rook for a knight here, but very powerful pawns avalanching in the center, and this is the kind of thing we want to get. Queen e2, c4 with the dynamic initiative for black. So I think that this variation is probably one of white's best, but black with very active play and sacrificial ideas can hold the balance. An alternative to knight on bd7, I suggested this move after knight c3, knight on bd7. An alternative is knight to c3, bishop b7, which is playable, but I think if we compare the variations, this is a little bit better for white. I would stick with knight on bd7. For example, here, e4, d4, e5, knight on fd7. The difference here, you see, black must go back passively with knight on fd7. With the knight on bd7, we have extra pressure on e5, so now we can play the more active knight to g4. That's the problem here. And there's one game that leads to trouble for black, knight e2. This variation, I think, has only been played in like one game, but it looks very, very bad for black. Bishop takes f3, g takes f3. Appears good at first glance, knight takes e5, but bishop g2, and suddenly white turns the tables on black. There'll be very big problems on the long diagonal, followed by the move f4. So white has, in reality, a very big advantage. We have to avoid bishop b7 and instead play the knight on bd7 against knight c3, knight on bd7. Following that example of the games Ernst versus Nuverik, black should have good practical counter chances. Going back to our starting position here for the Blumenfeld, we're going to look at accepted side lines, I'm going to call them. So side variations that start out as the accepted. D takes e6, f takes e6, and now other moves besides the second capture on b5. The first one is a positional line for white that I thought on the surface looked very harmless. This is not something you're going to run into every day, but oddly enough, in the course of creating this video series, I did have a blitz game online where my opponent played the following variation, knight to c3, and I got into a very bad position with black prior to studying this line. So this is a kind of secret move or secret variation that the average player doesn't know. It looks like white has abandoned his center and is now putting his knight into a position where it can be simply attacked. But there is some poison here, and I'm not sure that black can completely equalize, but we found the best possibilities for black. After knight to c3, b4, knight to b5, this was played with white by this very talented young French master, Garamian. This young guy is like 2650 at the time of me making this video series, playing for the French team in the European Team Championship. So his playing this variation concerns me. I mean, this is someone who has been trained or is strong enough to have trained himself to find a very, very unknown variation here, perhaps analyzing some new ideas. He played this in 2013 in a game where his opponent Menhao, this was Garamian versus Menhao, played in 2013. Black played the natural a6, and I think this is a mistake. It's not contributing anything to Black's position. And in this early stage of the opening, we have to constantly make moves that contribute to our position. So a6, knight d6 check, obviously preparation by Garamian. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. Black tries to just trade pieces, queen e7. But after bishop f4, Garamian maintains like a positional bind on the game. And Black, although he was almost holding on, was unable to really maintain the balance. I think that this could be playable if Black were to defend perfectly, but it's just not very pleasant. So instead of Menhaut's idea of a6, we need to find an improvement for Black. And fortunately, after knight to b5, this improvement exists. Black plays d6, just owning the d6 square. Not exactly a typical setup. It is a little ugly because we're just kind of backward along the d-file here. Obviously, white has to be careful, though. The knight on b5 can be trapped. So white has to act very alertly here. There's no time for bishop f4 because of e5, and then Black will win a piece with a6. White has to chip away at the Black pawn structure immediately. This move is absolutely forced, a3. And there's very, very little practice. There's really very little practice in this position. I found a couple of correspondence games, and that's it. No over-the-board master games. But it's a dangerous line, and I'm not surprised that the correspondence players went into this. Black could play knight c6. This is an untested try. Knight to c6, perhaps even taking with a knight sometimes on b4. But we're going to follow the main line here with a6. A takes b4, and now bishop to b7, defending the rook on e8, and therefore expelling the knight from b5. And the knight needs a good path, so going to c3 is not the best. And the white knight needs a good path, so going to c3 is not the best. The better plan is to go to a3. Position reminded me a little bit of a Bogo Indian, where Black plays c5 or something like that, recapturing with pieces on b4. Knight a3, and now c takes b4 follows our correspondence game. But it would be interesting, I thought here, and very speculative, to sacrifice a pawn with knight e4. This is risky, but just a suggestion. Possible pawn sacrifice, knight e4, b takes c5, and then knight to d7. Trying to just outstrip white in development completely. Speculative idea. My analysis is white feeding the pawn back with c6, bishop takes c6, then just trying to complete his development up a pawn with e3. This is probably not quite enough for Black. Black just not far enough ahead in development to justify being basically down a pawn. So if you're in the wild mood, maybe knight e4 is an interesting try in a fast time control game. 10 knight e4, but I think that objectively the sound play is to recapture here. So we're playing c takes b4, knight c2, that's white's plan with knight a3, and now you could possibly just play a5. It's not been tried yet, certainly playable, but in the one correspondence game I found that was reliable here, knight on bd7 was played. The idea being that the knight on b4 will be en prise. If you try to take on b4, Black starts to get active threats with d5. And you can be sure that these correspondence players were using strong computer programs to blunder check their moves. I mean, this is not just a speculative sacrifice. Black gets some initiative after knight takes b4. So in the actual game, g3 was played. But knight takes b4 remains interesting. You know, does Black have enough compensation here? it's a good question. I thought maybe a5, and then knight to c2, knight to c5. With some very concrete compensation, black has a lot of control of big squares, like the b3 square here. Could be annoying. So black's a little bit active, and I think he has significant compensation for the pawn. In the game, white declined the pawn sacrifice, played g3. And this is a game, William versus Schmidt, correspondence 2013. Knight c5, and again we see the idea of bishop h3. Hitting the base of our pawn chain. This is our weakest point in the Blumenfeld in many cases. d5, breaking actively, and white just again not materialistic at all. Castles, and after d takes c4, it appears that white is still slightly better. He will regain a pawn here on b4. So I would evaluate this as slightly better for white, but not earth-shaking. Probably black can hold a balance. He did, in fact, draw the game in this correspondence game. So if a strong computer can draw another strong computer in a correspondence game, basically, I think the position is okay for black. But I will admit that white is preferable here. So we still have to find some improvements in this rather rare variation that Garamian played. Next up is Ilincic's idea of e4. Serbian Grandmaster Zlatko Ilincic played several times with me in Budapest in 2005, 2006, where I successfully played the Blumenfeld against him. We've seen one or two of those games already, or at least the opening thereof. But after those games, Zlatko was searching for another variation, and I remember when I had stopped playing in those tournaments for a while, he came to me and said, "Look, I found this idea of e4." He was really excited about it. It's not a new idea. He didn't invent it, but he basically brought it back into practice. There are a number of interesting games in this variation since around the time of 2000, I believe 2007, 2008. We start seeing this game in Ilincic versus Ilner. This is a game from 2007, which is probably not the most important game for this variation. We'll take a look here at that and some others. So knight takes e4 is mandatory. Black given a chance to take the central pawn. It's a little bit scary. White's going to get Gambit-style attacking chances, but it really is absolutely necessary to eliminate the central pawn. Bishop d3. At this point, black has two possible moves. I think the crazy d5 was played in a move, but it just wrecked black's structure. In one game, Miklos Galiash just got a clear advantage with white. So d5 is not an option. Black has to play either bishop b7 or knight f6. There's some perhaps small differences, but oftentimes they might intertranspose. So we'll say bishop b7, developing a piece, is best. And now c takes b5, white gets his pawn. And now this is the critical question. In one game, black played bishop e7, but that move is just really not necessary here. So that was the Ilincic-Ilner game, bishop e7. And I think this is a very strange idea, bishop e7. Zlatko played queen c2, which may or may not be best. And Ilner played a very, very strange move here, knight to g5. This is just bad. And Ilincic got a huge position after knight takes g5, bishop takes g5, and queen takes c5. Another interesting move there was bishop g6 check. But theoretically, this is just bad for black, and I don't think that we should bother with it. But just instructive to see how Ilincic gets a massive advantage. Queen takes c5, bishop takes c1, and queen takes c1, with a very, very compact position, a pawn up. Oddly enough, instead of queen c2, there was another game where this variation was played, bishop e7, castles. None the less than Richard Rapport was playing with the white pieces against Krejci in 2010. Castles instead of queen c2, castles, rook e1, knight f6, knight c3, and then a6. A very good move, chipping away at the white center. Knight e5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5, and in Rapport versus Krejci, d5 was played. Scary looking move, but a good move. Much better than d6. It reminds us of a Nimzovich type of setup against the French. Queen e2, king h8, and a beautiful, beautiful game here by both sides, really, marred by Rapport's knight g4, pulling away from the center. And Krejci has an easy game after that. Knight to g4, knight takes g4. Knight takes g4 with at least equality, and Krejci was winning later, but unable to convert it and drew. But instead of knight takes g4, black has a really neat move here, knight to c6. And this is just a suggestion of the computer, but it's very strong. Queen takes e6. And then bishop to d6. Evidently, black is just better here. Despite being down a pawn, the black pieces are very, very well coordinated, and the white king comes under attack. So I thought this was interesting to note. But I think that our main defense will be to play like Laszlo Ganda did against Alekhine in 2010. Although the bishop e7 is playable, I prefer Ganda's knight to f6 instead. So, going back, we have Alenchich's e4, knight takes e4, bishop d3, bishop b7 developing a piece, c takes b5, and now not the speculative bishop e7, but just simply retreating the piece back with knight f6. We would play bishop e7 soon, but there's an important point to Ganda's move order. He had, I think, prepared for this game pretty heavily because Alekhine had already played this other game with Ilner. So Laszlo, a strong player, was able to heavily prepare. And at this point, white plays knight to g5. Maybe not the best move. Maybe somehow we can transport the game to the Rapport Krejci game with a different order of moves. But after something like Castle's bishop e7, it should transpose. But here, Alenchich's move knight g5 is very interesting and dynamic, and black should not play automatically. Ganda was very alert, well prepared. He played queen c7. And again, we see the modern strategy in this opening, the diagonals controlled by black. The tandem diagonals here. Castles, bishop d6. This is a critical variation. Zlatko Alekhine and Ganda both very well versed theoretically and doing a lot of work preparing. I mean, this is best played by both sides. g3 and now castles. And here Alekhine makes an interesting move. Queen c2. I'm not sure if this is best for white or not. This variation could definitely be seen again because I think that it may be critical. But queen c2 is interesting. Another possibility is just more natural development with knight to d2. This looks scary, and black has to be very, very careful. Perhaps next time Zlatko will try this. Knight to d2, and black has to actually retreat. There's no more play along the diagonal. c7, h2. Black has to be very careful here, but it looks like he can hold the balance. After knight d2, bishop e7, backtracking for the threat of knight e4, knight c4. Knight c4, and now a6, chipping away at that pawn on b5. Trying to undermine it so he can get the queen to c6 and get a diagonal attack with the queen front-loaded. Bishop f4, and now black has to be very, very careful. There's no e5 or d6. Queen d8, scary-looking position, but black's central majority should carry him through. Knight to d6, and now this bishop on b7, very valuable. But black needing to get out of the bind, willing to give it up. Queen b6. This is just analysis. Knight takes b7. Queen takes b7. Probably best play for both sides. I analyzed queen c2 now. h6, knight h7. And then the really cool move, rook c8. Threatening c4 in some positions. Dynamic balance here. White might remain with a very, very small advantage, but the play is extremely complicated. Black has chances. Okay, this is just analysis variation, probably best play for both sides. The actual game, Alekhine-Ganda, is interesting too. Zlatko played 12, queen c2. Again, after knight f6, knight to g5, queen c7 best. Castles. Bishop d6, g3. We forced a weakening in the white king side. Castles. Zlatko plays directly for pressure and weakening the black king side. Natural move. Queen c2, h6. Knight h7. Knight takes h7. Bishop takes check. King h8. And now bishop e4. Negating the power of the bishop on b7. But there's quite a lot of simplification, and I think that black is okay. Gonda here trades off that powerful pawn at b5 again. Knight to c3, and then a very accurate move, bishop e5, threatening to eliminate the knight on c3, win a pawn. And there's a little bit of tactical play here. b6. Queen takes b6, and it's basically a fancy exchange of pawns. Knight a4, queen b4, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, knight takes c5, and this is a Lynchich versus Gonda, Budapest 2010. White has an infinitesimal advantage. Queen c6, bishop e3, d6, queen e4, and then the game was drawn in a few moves. Bishop takes b2, they trade queens, knight takes c6. White has a just kind of token advantage. Knight takes e6, bishop takes a1, knight takes f8, and bishop d4. Game agreed, drawn. So just to sum up here, we've seen the possibility of playing the traditional main line in the accepted, which is fully playable. We'll get some alternatives to this that are important in the next part, but we've also seen some dangerous lines, some side variations, Garamian's knight c3, as well as Lynchich's e4. We have to be prepared for these as well as the main lines of the accepted Blumenfeld.